Imagine walking into a town where the front doors are wide open, but the streets are perfectly silent. The tables are still set for dinner, and the chairs are pulled out, but there isn't a single soul left to sit in them. It's a haunting liminal space, a place caught between what was and what is no longer. But it raises a question that feels almost unsettling. If there's no one left to see the houses, do the houses still exist? Or is the village only real because you're looking at it? That question, whether the village exists only because of the observer, is the core of how our social reality actually functions. We often think of the world as a collection of hard, objective facts, but so much of what we navigate every day is built on what I call the architecture of consensus. Think about it this way. Imagine a vast, empty field. Now imagine 1,000 people enter that field, and they all silently agree that there is an invisible wall exactly 10 feet from the entrance. They don't see a wall with their eyes, but they all behave as if it's there. They stop, they turn around, they describe the barrier to others. Eventually, for anyone entering that field, the wall becomes a fact. It's not made of stone or wood, but it has the same power as a wall. It dictates where you can go, how you move, and what you believe is possible. This is exactly how our villages of thought are constructed. Our culture, our laws, our social norms, and even our personal identities are often these invisible walls. We live in a reality shaped by the collective agreement of the people around us. If a society agrees that a piece of paper has value, it becomes wealth. If a culture agrees that a certain behavior is shameful, it becomes a social boundary. These aren't physical objects, but they are the scaffolding of our lives. They create the village we inhabit, a set of rules and perceptions that feel natural because so many other people are nodding their heads in agreement. When we talk about the architecture of consensus, we're looking at the structural integrity of these shared beliefs. It's a self-reinforcing loop. Because everyone acts as if the wall is there, it becomes harder for any single person to ignore it. We start to internalize the architecture. We don't just follow the rules, we start to believe the rules are part of the landscape itself. We stop asking why the wall exists and start worrying about what happens if we try to climb over it. This is why it's so difficult to imagine a different reality. The village of thought is so well built, so reinforced by the consensus of others, that we forget it was ever a construction at all. We mistake the map for the territory and the consensus for the truth. But when we start to pull on one thread of that consensus, we realize how much of our reality is actually just a shared story we've all agreed to tell ourselves, a story that defines the limits of our world. When we start to pull on those threads of consensus, we aren't just changing our minds, we are actually initiating a profound biological shift. Our brains aren't designed to be objective observers of the world. Instead, they function as prediction engines. They spend every millisecond trying to build a mental model of what's about to happen next so they can save energy. This is why a long-held belief feels so solid. It's a high-efficiency highway in your neural architecture. It allows your brain to move through life with minimal effort because the map it's using is already preloaded. But what happens when that highway is suddenly blocked by a reality that doesn't fit? This is where the neurobiology of cognitive dissonance takes over. Researchers have spent years looking at how the brain reacts when it hits a wall of prediction error, the gap between what we expect to see and what we actually experience. One of the most revealing areas of study involves the anterior cingulate cortex, which many neuroscientists describe as the brain's internal conflict monitor. In experiments looking at how we process conflicting information, researchers have observed a very specific neurological signature. When a person is presented with evidence that directly contradicts a core, deeply held belief, the anterior cingulate cortex lights up intensely. It's not just thinking harder in this moment. The brain is actually experiencing a form of physiological stress. It treats the contradiction as a literal threat to its internal stability. The brain is essentially screaming, "This doesn't fit the map," and that creates a state of high arousal tension that can feel like anxiety or even physical discomfort. To resolve this stress, the brain has two primary options. It can either desperately ignore the new information, effectively shutting the door on the outside world, or it has to physically reorganize its pathways. This is the sudden change we see in people who undergo a massive shift in perspective. It feels like a crisis because, at a neurological level, it is one. The brain has to decide whether to maintain the old, comfortable, but now broken highway, or to undergo the grueling, energy-intensive work of paving a new one. This biological friction is why it feels so painful to let go of a village we've lived in for years. It's not just a choice of logic, it's a negotiation with our own survival mechanisms. And once the brain finally decides to pave that new road, The old village doesn't just fade. It can actually start to feel like it never existed at all. But here's the thing about these vanishing villages. Even when the memory of the village itself starts to blur, the footprints we leave behind don't always disappear overnight. Think of it as identity architecture. When we spend years living within a specific set of rules, whether it's a high-pressure career, a social circle, or a belief system, we aren't just observing those rules. We are building neural pathways, the literal connections in our brains that make those behaviors our default settings. We become the architecture of that place. I think about a time when I spent several years working in a very rigid, high-stakes corporate environment. It was a world of constant urgency, where every minute was accounted for and every mistake felt like a catastrophe. When I finally left that job to pursue something completely different and much slower, I expected the stress to vanish the moment I handed in my resignation. But it didn't. For months, I found myself experiencing what I can only call ghost habits. I'd reach for my phone to check a notification that wasn't coming. I'd feel a sharp spike of anxiety at 10 a.m., my body preparing for a meeting that no longer existed. Even though the village of that company was gone, my internal house was still furnished with the furniture of that old life. I was living in an abandoned home, still reacting to the phantom noises of a life I had supposedly left behind. This is why personal identity is so stubborn. We often think of ourselves as a solid, singular entity, but we're actually a collection of these structures. When a major life change occurs, we don't just become someone new, we carry the blueprints of the old self with us. These habits are like the lingering smell of a house that's been empty for years. You can't see the previous tenants, but the scent remains in the curtains. These ghosts of old habits are significant because they can actually shape how we perceive our new reality. If your old village taught you that you had to be constantly on guard to be safe, you might find yourself looking for threats in your new home, even if there are none. We aren't just moving into a new space. We are often trying to figure out how to live in a new space, while still haunted by the layout of the old one. It's the invisible scaffolding of who we used to be, still supporting the weight of who we are trying to become. When that scaffolding moves from the individual to the group, it starts to build something much more tangible. It stops being just a private feeling in your chest and starts becoming the very walls around your house. This is where the script of fear takes hold. It's the process by which a community agrees on a narrative of danger, sometimes even a danger that hasn't actually manifested, and then proceeds to design a life that reacts to that ghost. We start to build ghost villages in our actual cities, structures that aren't designed for how we want to live, but for how we are afraid of living. A clear example of this is the massive surge in gated communities throughout the late 20th century. While these are often marketed as a luxury of privacy or exclusivity, sociologists have pointed out that they serve as a profound architectural expression of collective anxiety. When we look at these developments, we aren't just looking at houses with high fences, we're looking at a physical manifestation of a social script. The fear isn't always a specific, localized threat. Instead, it's often a vague, generalized fear of the outside or the other. By building these barriers, we aren't just keeping something out. We are actively constructing a reality where the only people we interact with are the ones who agree to the same fear as us. This creates a powerful feedback loop. The more we wall ourselves off to feel safe, the less we understand the world beyond the gate, which in turn makes that world seem even more mysterious or dangerous. The fear validates the wall, and the wall reinforces the fear. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy made of brick and mortar. This is the ultimate ghost village. It's a space where the social structure is dictated by a what-if rather than a what-is. It limits where people can walk, who they can talk to, and how they perceive their neighbors. We end up living in a self-imposed constraint, where our movement is restricted by a script we didn't consciously write, but collectively accepted. We think we're choosing safety, but we might actually be opting into a curated reality that keeps us from ever truly seeing the landscape as it actually exists. We become inhabitants of a fortress built to protect us from a shadow, only to find that the fortress itself becomes the most defining part of our lives. We live in those fortresses every day, often without even noticing the walls are there. We mistake the architecture of our fears for the natural boundaries of our capabilities. It's so easy to let the safe path become our only path because the fortress is familiar and the outside world feels unpredictable. This is exactly where Elias finds himself. He's standing before that note, and for him, it's the first time the veil is actually lifting. It's the moment the invisible village starts to crack, revealing that the boundaries he thought were physical are actually psychological. To understand what Elias is feeling, Imagine someone who has spent their entire life believing they simply aren't the type of person who can lead others. Maybe they were told early on that they were too quiet, or perhaps they watched a parent struggle with authority and internalized that same struggle as a personal limitation. They've spent years saying no to promotions, no to organizing community events, and no to any role that requires them to step into the spotlight. They've built a very stable, very respectable life around this belief, and they've convinced themselves that this is just who they are. They think they're being humble or realistic, but they're actually just following a set of instructions they never asked for. But then, one day, something shifts. Maybe they see a colleague step into a role with grace, or they find themselves in a situation where they have to speak up, and for a split second, the no in their head feels like an echo rather than their own voice. They see a note from reality. It's a sudden, sharp realization that this limitation wasn't a discovery they made about their own nature. It was a gift they were handed by a teacher, a parent, or a culture. It's the moment they realize the script they've been following is actually written in someone else's handwriting. That is the threshold of understanding. It's the terrifying, exhilarating moment when you stop asking, "What can I do?" and start asking, "Who told me I couldn't?" It's the realization that the invisible village isn't a place you live in, but a set of rules you've been taught to follow. For Elias, the note is the invitation to stop being a tenant in a house built by his predecessors and start deciding where the doors actually go. It's the transition from being a character in a story to finally picking up the pen. When we talk about picking up the pen, we aren't just talking about one person's internal journey. We're talking about the collective way human beings have functioned for thousands of years. Throughout history, our species has repeatedly vanished from old ways of thinking to build entirely new ones. We do this by dismantling the invisible villages of our ancestors and replacing them with structures we can actually inhabit. Think about the transition from a geocentric to a heliocentric universe. For centuries, the invisible village of the human mind was built on the absolute certainty that the Earth was the stationary center of all existence. This wasn't just a scientific fact, it was a psychological foundation. It provided a sense of purpose, a clear place in the divine order, and a defined boundary for what was possible. People didn't just believe in a still Earth, they lived within the rules that belief created. It shaped their commerce, their religion, and their very sense of safety. But then the paradigm shifted. When figures like Copernicus and Galileo began to suggest that the Earth was actually orbiting the Sun, they weren't just moving dots on a map. They were asking humanity to vanish from its old home. They were demanding that people abandon a reality they had lived in for generations, a reality that felt solid and true for a new one that felt dizzying, cold, and uncertain. It was a psychic earthquake. This is how our internal evolution works on a macro scale. It's not a smooth, linear progression where we just add new facts to a growing pile of knowledge. Instead, it's a collapse. It's the moment the old village becomes uninhabitable because the invisible rules that held it up are revealed to be fiction. We don't just learn new things. We have to experience a sort of collective amnesia where the old way of thinking dies so the new one can be born. When you look at the history of human progress, it's really a graveyard of vanished realities. We have moved from a world where the Earth was still, to a world where it spins, to a world where we understand the vast invisible forces of gravity and relativity. Each step required us to walk away from a truth that no longer served us. It shows us that our current beliefs are rarely permanent. They are just the current village we've decided to inhabit, and just like the ones before it, they are waiting for the moment we decide to move on. Ultimately, the mystery of Elias's vanishing village isn't about a physical location that disappeared into thin air. It's a mirror held up to our own inner lives. We spend so much time navigating the streets of our own convictions, the shoulds, the can'ts, and the always haves, that we often mistake these mental blueprints for the solid ground of reality. The village vanishes the moment we realize that we are the architects. We aren't trapped in a world built by someone else. We are living in a reality constructed by our own fears and histories. To step outside that village, you don't need a new map or a hidden destination. You simply need the courage to recognize the walls you built and the realization that you have the power to walk through them. If you're ready to keep exploring these invisible structures, join us as a student of the invisible in our Hidden Mysteries series. Subscribe today, and let's continue this journey into the underlying layers of our shared human experience together.